guests today, Betty Anholt and Charles LeBuff, have both made a huge contribution to this beautiful sanctuary island that we call home. And Betty is our island historian and author. She is the recipient of the first Guardian of History Award, named the Betty Anholt Guardian of History Award, established by the Captiva Island Historical Society. And her recognition focused on her lifelong dedication to discovering and sharing the stories and cultures that have formed Sanibel and Captiva, the Sanibel and Captiva of today. She has published 4 books and has written numerous articles. And as many of you know who have been doing research for one project or another here at the village, she is always at the library to help us and always so willing. So we can't thank her enough for her contribution. And Charles, very interesting. He was born in Massachusetts and moved to Bonita Springs, Florida in 1952. He became a long federal, he began a long federal career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 1957 at the Red Tide Field Investigation Library in Naples. Then in 1958, he was selected to fill the number 2 position at the Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge, later to become the Ding Darling Wildlife Refuge. He spent 32 years as a wildlife technician at the refuge. Charles retired from his position in 1990, but remained on Sanibel until 2005. During his time on Sanibel Island, and in other than his official work capacity, he served as president of the Sanibel Captiva Audubon Society, was a founding board member of the SanCap Conservation Foundation, was twice elected to the Sanibel City Council, serving his community from 1974 to 1980. And he founded and directed a loggerhead sea turtle conservation progress, Coretta Research, Inc., that has continued since 1992 under the auspices of the SanCap Conservation Foundation. So we're very honored to have both of these people today. In the introduction of their book, and this is Protecting Sanibel and Captiva Islands, the Conservation Story, they address Sanibel and Captiva as ecological marvels when one compares them to most of Florida's grossly overcrowded barrier islands. Our island's special nature lies in the powerful conservation ethic that is preserved, and a sense of place that has been visible for well over 100 years. How did this happen, and why did it happen? Development pressures were as dramatic as the rest, in barrier islands in Florida. But thankfully, our early settlers and community were truly focused on conserving what our island had to offer. Charles and Betty, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing all about your book. And incidentally, this book is fantastic. Thank you. Well, this way. Well, no, I guess I can't. Okay. Pillars in the way. All right. Basically, there's so many different aspects of our conservation history to talk about that, we can't cover all of them. So I'm hoping for a lot of back and forth here, questions and whatever. But I'm just going to mention a few topics and talk about one or two, and have Charles do the same, and then we'll really get into the back and forth. And I hope you'll come up with some good questions or discussion topics, and off we'll go. We started because we felt very important. We started with the geology and also meteorology, or hurricanes in particular, and the way that they affected the islands.
We talked about the Calusa. We talked about the Calusa and the Spanish, particularly Juan Ponce de Leon. And in 1521, 499 years ago, his first attempt at developing a town here in the entire continental United States, right here on San Carlos Bay. We can talk a little bit about that if you like. And some of the influences that he brought nearly 500 years ago, like cattle, that still exist today here in the state, not so much on Sanibel. Yeah. Then we can also talk about the Cuban fishing ranchos and their commercial fishing proclivities that have reached from the time of the Calusa right up to the present day. We can talk about, that wonderful map in the other room, the 1833 map, and that development. One of the things I wanted to kind of expand on a little bit, because of the water quality issues that we've had the last year or so, and the concern about cyanobacteria and all of that, was the dredging of the Caloosahatchee and how that came to be and what we're still affecting today. The dredging of the Caloosahatchee actually happened before homesteading happened out here on the islands, before the lighthouse was built, before Thomas Edison found this area, a lot of befores. So why did it happen then? And the reason basically was because Florida was bankrupt. Get some water here. Florida had been given by the federal government when it became a state in 1845, something like 15 million acres of swamp and overflow lands, basically the southern half or more of the peninsula. And Florida had the obligation to develop this. So what they did is they turned around and underwrote guaranteed bonds and donated lands to various railroads. And that evolution they thought would end up bringing development further south. There were railroads in northern Florida, up on the Panhandle and over to Jacksonville, up in that area, but nothing kind of south of what you might call Ocala area, Fort King at that time. And that was the hope. But then the Civil War intervened, or the war between the states, or the war of Yankee aggression, depending on where you are. Yeah. That happened, and then the aftermath, trying to get things put back together again. Then in 1873 was something called the Panic, or the Great Depression of 1873. So financial difficulties ensued. The railroads couldn't meet their obligations to the banks. And so the state of Florida was on the hook. They had to pay this off. And they couldn't do it. They were just about ready to go bankrupt. And then they discovered an angel, I guess you would say, in Hamilton Diston, who was a saw manufacturer in Philadelphia. He was quite wealthy. Saws at that time, you think logging and all of the hand sawing that gets done. Anyway, he paid the state of Florida $1 million for 4 million acres of land in this vicinity in South. And so 25 cents an acre, including Sanibel, folks. Yeah. So he had an obligation with this purchase, and that was to drain all of this swamp and never overflow land. And so he turned around and hired a company, a couple of brothers named Mengi or Mengi, I'm not sure of the pronunciation. And they took a dredge that their father had built in 1881, went up the Caloosahatchee, gradually all the way up to Lake Okeechobee. The Caloosahatchee at that time did not extend to Lake Okeechobee. It only went as far as a lake called Lake Hicpochee. And they dredged that to open Lake Okeechobee to empty it about 4 feet or so. They also took out, we had a little waterfall in the Caloosahatchee up near LaBelle. It was a series of rapids, but it was about a 10-foot drop. So it was, you know, it was a pretty significant one. It would have been fun in a kayak, I'm sure. You know, it was actually a rapids area that the Caloosa had built a canal system around many years previously, many centuries previously. So that was the start, the original sin, if you will, of all of the stuff in Okeechobee and all up the Kissimmee River, which was done in exactly the same way, as well as the St. Lucie, where all of the flow from Kissimmee and St. Cloud area, Orlando area, coming down into the lake was being transferred right straight down to where we catch it here on Sanibel. So, like I say, that was before homesteading, before much of the other things that went on. But in the midst of that, we had a man who had a rod and reel out in Tarpon Bay. He caught a tarpon on rod and reel the first time it had ever been done. They advertised it wildly in New York City, and many of his friends came roaring down. That was the start of our tourism epidemic. Okay, wrong word. Okay. Anyway, once people got used to coming down here in the winter, they started looking around and looking at our beautiful natural environment and seeing our plume birds, and then they started to think, wouldn't that look fashionable on my great big hat? And at that point, I'm going to turn it over to Charles for a little bit, and I hope you'll come up with some questions and thoughts and the rest of it.
So I'll pick up where Betty left off, basically from the time of the plume hunters. Americans were going west for gold, most that were looking for a better way of life, to the gold fields of California and up to Alaska. But there was a group of people that were coming south into Florida for another source of gold, something that was worth more than gold. These were the plume hunters, the people that went out to bird rookeries, willfully shot birds in nuptial plumage, egrets and herons, roseate spoonbills, for the millinery trade. And 1 ounce of snowy egret feathers were worth more than an ounce of gold. It was an extremely lucrative business, and no one was controlling it. People all over the country started complaining. Audubon societies were formed, and in 1902, the Florida Audubon Society hired the first Audubon warden. An Audubon warden was an early game warden. They were deputized by the counties where they worked. For example, the first Audubon warden, Guy Bradley, was deputized by the sheriff of Monroe County in Key West. And some of you may know that about 3 years after he was hired, Guy Bradley became the first of the wildlife martyrs. He was killed by plume hunters down at Flamingo. they were very important, and without the Audubon wardens, there would have been no protection afforded the birds. Once the plume hunters found the fantastic rookery at Cuthbert Lake in today's Everglades National Park, then the total destruction of these birds was soon to approach, and they would reach extinction. So they increased the number of Audubon wardens, and we had another Audubon warden assigned to, eventually it was part of Charlotte County, and he lived up on a small key near Placida, in behind Boca Grande. His name was Columbus McLeod, and in 1908 he met the same fate as Guy Bradley. He was killed by poachers. Back in those days, the federal government wasn't really involved in wildlife conservation or protection at any great level. The Bureau of Biological Survey, who controlled wildlife populations nationally, only had 25 agents in the whole country. So these Audubon wardens were essential for protection. About 1900, the federal government finally woke up and Congress passed the Lacey Act, which prohibited the interstate sale and transportation of certain species of wildlife. And that is still in effect today. The first national wildlife refuge that was developed in 1903 by Teddy Roosevelt was over at Pelican Island near Sebastian on the East Coast. And that was also a rookery that was despoiled by plume hunters. Now, a plume hunter wasn't a person who went out and accurately shot an individual bird. They would approach a roost near dusk when the birds were all settled in for the night, and they'd take scatter guns and just blast away and kill everything they hit. They'd take the adult birds that had plumes, and the rest would starve in the nest. It was really a tragedy. So Teddy Roosevelt started the first National Wildlife Refuge, and then he created 3 refuges here in Lee and Charlotte County, and things picked up. And then in 1918, the Congress passed the Migratory Bird Treaty Act with Canada, U.S., and Mexico, and that started to control things. And in the 30s, Florida developed a game commission that controlled, basically it was geared for hunters, but it controlled wildlife populations. So very slowly, with the passage of the federal acts, these mass killings on bird rookeries was curtailed. And very, very slowly, wildlife populations, bird populations began to increase. Roseate spoonbills were down to nearly nothing by 1920. There was still illicit hunting going on, but it wasn't at the great scale that it was prior to federal enactment of regulations. And the same thing was going on here on Sanibel. There were people that would go up to Charlotte Harbor, Pine Island Sound, Matlacha Pass, kill birds. They wouldn't get announced because they were very light, but they slowly, the wanton waste of those migratory birds ended. The people on Sanibel were a little different than people on the mainland. There was a core, even in the earliest days of the homesteading era, and when the islands began to grow and the economy changed from farming to other things, there was a core group of people that had an interest in safeguarding the natural resources. And by 1935, Ding Darling arrived on Captiva, and people knew of his alignment to conservation efforts. They knew he was one of the early directors of the Bureau of Biological Survey under FDR, and he was a great conservation-themed cartoonist, not only political, but also conservation-themed. So they got allied with Ding Darling, and they wanted to do something. So Ding Darling sort of said, well, I'll try to train this in the direction that it should go. So in 1939, with the efforts of a commission that was formed on Sanibel Captiva, the state legislature passed an act, a special act, in 1939, setting up Sanibel and part of Captiva as a state wildlife refuge. Thank you. Bear with me a moment. I'm drying up. But Ding Darling really wasn't satisfied with that, and he decided there should be more. There should be more protection. So he began to push, and the people in the committee and the local people that were supporting the committee decided that there should be a national wildlife refuge created on these islands. So after the 1939 Act was enacted, the Lee County Refuge Commission was established by the state legislature, and members were appointed by the Florida Game and Freshwater Fish Commission. That was the FWC back in the old days. And residents of Captiva and Sanibel were appointed to this commission. And one of the first things they did was hire a warden, not an Audubon warden, but a warden under their auspices. And they hired the first warden for the islands. His name was Edward Underhill. His nickname was Muggins. And he was warden for a couple of years. And by about 1943-44, the Biological Survey in about 40 had become the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service when FDR did some alignment in the Department of Interior. And they hired the first Fish and Wildlife Service warden. His name was Jake Stokes. Some of you may have remembered Jake. He stayed here for most of his life, but he was one of the people that wanted the bridge, and when the bridge came in, he didn't like what he got, so he moved away. Oh, that's a lot of people did that. Believe me, a lot of people. Well, I got off on a little tangent there. I'm known for that, so let's see where I was.
That's another topic.
Good, whole topic. Jake Stokes was the second warden, official Fish and Wildlife Service warden. And then in 1945, by a memorandum, President Truman formed the Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge. And then in 1947, he edicted a closure order all around Sanibel and just part of Captiva, where it was prohibited to hunt or take migratory birds. But there was still no warden here. Jake Stokes hung around as warden until about 1947, and then a patrolman from way up in Tampa Bay would occasionally patrol Sanibel and all of the other Rookery Islands, public and privately owned, and just to protect the resource. In 1949, the U.S. Coast Guard decided to vacate the Sanibel Lighthouse. They proclaimed it to be automated and unmanned. In April of 1949, the first refuge manager, Tommy Wood, transferred in from, he was supervising the Key West Refuge and the Great White Heron Refuge, and he was transferred to Sanibel in April of 1949 and became manager of the refuge. And he found out that the lighthouse was, it was accessed. There was no one living there or doing anything there. So since it was a federal agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service applied to use the property as a headquarters for the refuge. And in 1949, Tommy and Louise Wood moved into the lighthouse and remained there until he retired. So after that, do you want me to go take the organizational transition, or do you want to just
Or we can just open it up.
open it up now?
It's so interesting what
Do
you're
we have
saying.
enough for questions?
We love hearing what you're having to say. I have never heard anything about the Plumers before until that's.
Well, my new book is on the table, The Audubon Warden.
It's,
And it's somewhat autobiographical because In 1959, I was commissioned a federal officer, and about the same time I was commissioned a deputy Florida game warden. So I had the same duties. I was the modern application of the old Audubon wardens, and the things that I did was the same thing that the Audubon wardens did.
Yeah.
We're going to throw it for questions
Sure,
now?
why not?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Charles, before Ding Darling was created by the government, who owned that land? And how did the transfer of that ownership?
Okay.
Very
That's
complicated.
That's a good question, and I fully covered it in the section in the book that I wrote on that. Really, there's some prose in this book that came from an individual in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's been lost to you newcomers. You should really go to the library and get the book, but read the positions that were made on the future of Sanibel. It was done, when the refuge was first established. We may spend all day here now, we get done going. When the refuge was first established, they owned no property. They had a revocable lease on the lighthouse tract. And then Ding Darling he was a very pushy individual. I met him twice. And he was very, very loud and very forceful in his opinions. And he thought that the Fish and Wildlife Service should have some land on Sanibel. They had a lease with the state of Florida on all the mangrove lands north of Sandcap Road, 2,000 acres of state and school lands. But he wanted the Fish and Wildlife Service to own something. So he finagled with Frank Bailey, and he managed to get an acre in what is today the Bailey Tract. And with his own money, he put down a well, a deep artesian well. But see, there's just not enough time to go into all of this in an oral presentation, because it could take forever.
Yes.
So
Next Monday.
in the end, the Fish and Wildlife Service bought the 100-acre Bailey Tract, which is still here. And,
From the Baileys.
from the Bailey family. There are stories that it was given by the Baileys. It was not given by the Baileys. It was sold to the government for $5,000, $50 an acre. And so after Ding Darling died in 1963, a group of people here on the island formed the J.N. Ding Darling Memorial Sanctuary Committee. They wanted to do something to perpetuate the fame of this great man, and he was a great man. And they pushed the Fish and Wildlife Service to become engaged in doing this. And the Fish and Wildlife Service made a commitment. Congress appropriated $3 million for acquisition of lands on Sanibel. Captiva was excluded from the refuge boundary at this time. So the program started, and they would buy individual parcels of property. First of all, they had to get approval by the county commission. And in a very unlikely move by the county commission of the time, they approved the boundary of the refuge. So the Fish and Wildlife Service began to buy small tracts of land. If it was in that boundary and you didn't want to sell it, it was condemned and it was taken under condemnation proceedings.
Eminent domain.
Eminent domain. There's another term for it that's left my head. If it get it, I'll come back to it. So there were mostly willing sellers, but there were a few that had thoughts in their head of developing the land. There were several tracts along Sanibel Captiva Road. They stonewalled the government, wouldn't sell. So a declaration of taking is the term that I want. The Fish and Wildlife Service did a declaration of taking, and immediately took title to those lands. And the day that was done, it was my responsibility to post those lands as federal lands, National Wildlife Refuge. And then it went to court. And it had to go to federal court. And I had to travel many times to the federal courthouse in Tampa and testify. And everything worked out.
What year?
This started in about 1970 through 75 in that area. I think it was all done by 76. I think there's still a few in-holdings that the people have no access to, so they can't use it, so it's within the boundary. I was going to go somewhere else, and I forgot where I was going to go.
You were talking about the tracks that they were purchasing.
Yeah, they bought all the land, and there's I don't think, did I put the story about the Palm Ridge Road tract to Tarpon Bay in the book? I don't think we did.
Yeah.
But that's a whole other story that we just don't have time for.
So Ding Darling didn't buy what we know as the refuge. He bought the tract.
He bought
on Tarpon Bay
he
Road.
bought 1 acre of the tract, and he had tried.
Right.
The land, the school and state lands were scheduled to be auctioned off by the state, and
Well,
Ding
the school
got-
was built in 64, so
Yep.
63.
Well, that's another story too.
I know, but that was part of that tract of land you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, but there was consideration to take that too. The school wouldn't have been there.
Okay.
But because there were plans for the school, well, the school had already gone in, so they decided not to. And the same thing, they planned to go all the way and take Wolford Point. And it's a damn shame to me they didn't do it. But they didn't do it because Calusa subdivision was at the western boundary, and they didn't want to negotiate that private holding with buildings, so that's why they
the
had,
people that formed this,
that's where I was going.
thank you.
So in 1963, when Ding Darling died, this committee morphed in 1967 into the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation. And they kept pushing and pushing. And in 1967, after a very difficult time with Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall under the Kennedy administration, Udall did not want national wildlife refuges named after humans, after people. And he wouldn't sign off on changing the refuge's name. But finally he reconsidered and did. So in 67, it was renamed the Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge.
Which was actually under Johnson
Pardon me,
by then.
was the J.N. Ding Darling
Yes.
National Wildlife Refuge.
Yeah.
Well, what about the lighthouse track? What happened there?
Well, we stayed there until 1982. In about 1980, when I was still on the city council, I knew it was coming down, that we were leaving. So I went to Bernie Murphy and suggested that he start negotiating with the U.S. Coast Guard, and he did. When we left, the city of Sanibel took over management. And then in 2010? When did the city buy it, Deb? 2010. The city paid less than $700 for the land. And they own everything, but the Coast Guard still maintains the light.
When did you build the Wildlife Drive, and why did you build it? Who built it?
The Lee County Mosquito Control had channelized all of Sanibel, and Tommy Wood, the refuge manager, although we didn't own the land, we leased it from the state, so we had management oversight on it. He decided that he would build a wildlife observation drive. So Lee County Mosquito Control, at no cost to the government, dug that over I think like a 4-year period. It was finished in 65, I think. And then the drag line went on to Buck Key and rake Buck Key with mosquito ditches.
Yeah.
But is the water there natural, or is that dug next to the roads in Ding
Well,
Darling?
there's a
That's
canal
natural.
right next to,
But is
Yes.
the water, the big ponds, are they natural?
You know, they're
Oh, yeah.
natural.
Yeah.
Okay, they left that natural.
That's all natural, just the road and
Yeah,
that footprint.
basically they dug and piled up so that there would be a drive area.
Yeah, that
Yeah, and then
filter.
connected to some of the higher land as they went around.
How does it
ditches.
control mosquitoes? What does it do?
Well, mosquitoes will, depending on the species, but they lay eggs in the wet mud. The changing from dry to wet is what encourages. The eggs can lay there for years without hatching if the water control is different. But if it's like wet sand, they can come off. If the water maintains on top of it, they're not going to hatch. So they're basically, it's not really drowning the eggs, but it's controlling the eggs. So it's the up and down of the tides that give you waves of mosquitoes, particularly high and low tides, because high and low tides, you know, the moon tides, give you more expansive sand to bring
It's also
hatches.
giving predators
Is that
access
the
to
same?
eat the mosquito
Or
larvae.
do they do it from airplanes? Is that-
Well, that came later, yeah.
It was in the 50s, wasn't it, when they really got into mosquito control here on the island?
Yeah, about 53.
Well,
More-
Sanibel
more
had its own,
provost
had its own
and-
district at one time, and then the state did
Yeah.
studies here at the lighthouse.
And then
Yeah.
how did it all come about, so you got it under control? What?
I think they were the second one in the state to the mosquito control district. I think they were
Yes.
second.
They formed in 58, I believe. I think they actually formed earlier, but their website says 58, because they were already digging over here on Sanibel in 58.
And they were digging the Sanibel Slough, is that what you?
Sanibel Slough.
Slough, okay, the slough.
Connecting
Okay.
areas
And
of
Can you talk a little bit
water.
about that and how it really alleviated our mosquito problem, or really took care of?
Well, again, it was stabilizing water levels
Okay.
that decreased the mosquito population. And then later they were using various pesticides and whatever, and like you say, from a plane. Then later on from
Did they
helicopters.
use DDT at times?
They did it first.
Yeah.
And
They
Then
didn't know what they were
Then they went to
doing.
malathion as an adulticide.
Baytex.
One thing that's important, I think it's important, a lot of people today condemn the ditching of the Sanibel Slough. You'll hear some of these conservation leaders say that, but they must bear in mind that before Lee County Mosquito Control started ditching this island, there was no permanent fresh water on the island. In the spring, March, April, May, this was like a desert island. Everything was bone dry. This man has had his hand up. Yes, sir.
What was the penalty? What authority did the wardens have if they caught somebody shooting?
Okay, they were a deputy sheriff of the county in which they worked, or several counties, in the case of some of them. And they had the power of arrest and the power of serving warrants. So they had the same authority as a deputy sheriff that stops you on I-75 for speeding.
So
He could-
was it a
he could-
financial penalty or?
Yes, sir, he'd take you to jail. He'd take you, in the case of Guy Bradley, he had to go all the way to Key West, back before there was a bridge. He had to sail a sloop all the way to Key West from Flamingo on the southern tip of Florida.
The sloop he was killed on.
The sloop he was killed on. Those were tough times.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Going back a bit, to the Audubon Awards and so forth, aside from their power, arrest powers and so forth, but you're talking about a handful of men
Yeah.
in charge of, meant to stop a multitude of plumage hunters on tens of thousands of acres. How do they do this? In practically, what did they do?
They had seasonal assistants that were hired to support them. But even though it's a large, vast acreage, these bird colonies are isolated, known points. So they had to concentrate on patrolling them. And that's basically how they did it. And the bad guy never knew where they were going to be. That's the secret of wildlife protection.
All right, now, practically speaking, you've got a warden or an assistant sitting out there in the boondocks somewhere. He spots a foliage hunter. He arrests him. How? What does he do?
Told him he's under arrest.
Yeah,
Put out his hands.
That's fine in theory, but practically speaking, what could he do?
He could arrest him.
How?
By telling him he's under arrest. And he had a gun, he would identify himself. I am Audubon Warden Columbus McLeod. You're in violation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. You're under arrest. Put out your hands.
He had that authority.
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
But you're on the boondocks and people have guns.
That's right. That's what happened to both of those men.
Well,
That's right.
so now we know.
And that happens today. It happens today.
Yeah.
A game warden, a state or a federal game warden, has a more dangerous job than a policeman. Because when you walk into a deer camp or a duck camp, everybody's a drunk. You don't deal with that when you're a normal highway patrolman or a deputy sheriff. It's a very dangerous job. I could tell you all sorts of stories, but it would take a week.
Well, one of the things too, keep in mind that the rookeries were at a concentrated period of time in the late winter and spring. So that's when there was a concentrated, the plume birds are only pluming, they only have their nuptial plumes at a certain time of the year. So that's when there's this huge uptick of poachers and also of pressure to keep that poaching down. So it's not a year-round type of thing, although the job is year-round, because there are other aspects of the job, not just plume hunters.
And there were other aspects, like those same plume hunters would go to these keys and kill white ibis as a food material.
Absolutely.
That's still done today.
Chokoloskee chicken.
Yeah.
Really? And talking, going back to the mosquitoes, I know when we give tours, we talk about, some of the former enemies of Sanibel, which was the heat, the hurricanes, and the mosquitoes, and how the mosquitoes became, got it under control. But we talk about that night that they measured over 370,000 of salt marsh.
365,000 females.
Okay. How did they, and people say, well, how do they know that? How did they count that? Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
It can be done by weight,
Okay.
and it can be done with little sectional transects per square inch,
Okay.
and multiply it out.
Okay, we just wondered, who took the time to count that?
And that light trap broke,
Yeah.
overflowed and broke.
Was there no problem with
There were more than that.
Pardon?
malaria, mosquitoes?
There has been malaria in Florida, but it's not, I think yellow fever was more serious around here
Yes.
than malaria.
And there was yellow fever around this area, although I think most of it was brought from other areas, other ports of call, particularly Havana and Key West and New Orleans. We had a port at Punta Rassa where at one point a ship that had come in had yellow fever on board. And they buried 3. There's 3 graves over there, unmarked graves somewhere, for victims of yellow fever that died overnight while they were there.
You've got all these mosquitoes, and none of them are malaria-carrying mosquitoes?
Right.
Salt marsh.
The salt marsh mosquito is a vector of dog heartworm, and I think that's the only thing that it transmits.
Oh.
But mosquitoes are, all over the world, and there are different kinds brought in. A lot of the ships, they had a very damp interior bottom of the ship. It was wonderful breeding grounds for mosquitoes. And so they were bringing their own bugs here. Yeah.
Yeah.
How big harbor and dockage and all that was Ponderosa?
Well, it depends on when you're talking about, obviously. That became, well, first it was a Seminole War fort area, and a hurricane wiped out the fort. They moved upriver to the now Fort Myers area, but it became a cable telegraph station right after the Civil War, and they were shipping cattle from there down to Cuba, and that was a major port at that time. So basically, I would say maybe 1870 to 1900 was its peak. And then it became a tourist destination.
Was there a town around it at that point?
Well, there were several buildings. There were certainly a lot of cattle pens because they drove the cattle to there to load them on the ships. The cattle were live cattle as they shipped them. But it wasn't a big town, no.
So there's nothing over there now that
It's all gone, yeah, unfortunately.
Wasn't there a hotel there at one time?
There was a huge hotel there. It was basically tourist-oriented, and George Schultz, who ran the telegraph station from the time basically about 1866 on well into the 20th century, built a hotel first out of the original barracks, what was left over from the barracks from the fort, and then afterwards built another hotel there. The place burned, the place was rebuilt, the place almost instantly, like within 6 years, burned again. But if you've ever seen a picture of that hotel, it's like
It's huge.
covers, yeah, lots of area.
So was it a resort area? Or what?
Definitely a resort.
And they
This
used
was appealing to those tarpon fishermen in particular. But, you know, it was a place to stop. In fact, that's where Edison stopped when he was kind of pushed upriver. Yeah,
Betty, can you talk about that 1833 map a little?
sure.
Alluded to it.
The map or the development or?
Just how it came to be, and, you know, when we, as docents, when we were in the other room, everybody wants to know what it is.
Well, the map is illustrating what this land company was trying to sell. And they were looking for 50 investors in this area. If you look at the map, you'll see it's subdivided, and it is 50 different lots, as well as the town on the eastern end. And each one of these lots would be had by an investor, and in addition, they would have about 1,800 acres of land on the mainland. This land company owned basically up to up to Tampa Bay area on this western side of Florida, or they thought they owned it. This whole thing became invalid in the courts in about 1905. They were fighting for like 80 years about this. But they owned this lot on Sanibel, and they owned 1,800 for $500. That eastern end of Sanibel, that with the roads showing on the map and everything, that was actually an incorporated town, the town of Sanibel, in 1833. There was also a second town incorporated on Sanibel that same year called Murray, and it was on the western end, quote unquote. I'm assuming that it was on Wolford, but that's just an assumption. I don't know. But this land company thought they had, through a man who was an ambassador to Spain and had been given a grant by the King of Spain right at the time that Spain turned over Florida to the U.S. He thought he owned this piece of property, and it turns out that that particular grant was considered invalid.
Did anyone actually come and live?
They came and lived here. They came in January of 1833. They were here a couple of years.
About how many people came?
I don't know at the
I mean, if they
highest
incorporated
extent, but they had two-story house built, they had a number of other houses. The Cuban fishing ranchos had built their original some palmetto sheds for them to originally live in, and then they built houses.
Where did they get the carpenters, or how did they?
They brought them. Yeah,
They brought
they
them
were.
with them, okay.
Key West was your huge town, if you want to call it that, and they came from Key West.
I had not heard that story before. I didn't realize
yeah.
they'd actually built houses and we had.
So they stayed here. They asked for a lighthouse at that time, 50 years before we got it.
So where did they all
51.
go?
Getting there.
I'm sorry, Betty, what years was that they were here?
1833 to 1835. And in 1835, number one, there was a very heavy, strong hurricane that did a lot of damage and scared them off a lot. But even more so, it was the start of the Second Seminole War. People were killed in outlying regions. A man was killed. He was a customs inspector up on Usepa. And it was all blamed on the Indians, the Seminoles. And everyone got scared. And this whole region basically was emptied of people. They all went right back to Key West and then to wherever.
Are there any remnants of the buildings?
Not anymore. Mm-mm.
Well, why did it take 80 years to determine that it was not legal? What happened to the people who put up $500?
Courts.
Yeah, it was a fight through courts. I mean, would you really want to let go, you know, a quarter of the entire state if you could keep it, you know? Yeah, it was a big fight. It ended in 1905. And that was after homesteading had begun and people were living in this, you know.
How many original Sanibel homesteaders were there?
Probably about 40, but I'm just pulling that out of the air. I don't know. The first one was Sam Woodring, or at least that's considered to be the first one, because he was living over on the south end of Pine Island, St. James City, and had his plans in place. But, you know, there were a number of them. A lot of them came from Kentucky. And I think you can pretty much blame all that on the Reverend George Barnes, because he certainly touted the area. Yeah.
I'm interested in the fresh water. I didn't realize that the slough didn't really come in until 53. So those first 50 years of the century, and Charles mentioned...
Well, it would depend on the time of the year.
How did they get fresh water?
Well, basically rainwater in a cistern, collecting rainwater, or a shallow well.
Would that last through the 3 months of drought?
Sometimes. There was always movement back and forth with various small steamers. You know, I'm sure if you came to a point of totally no water, you could get a barrel of water over here, but it wasn't easy, you know.
Originally at the lighthouse, there were 3 potable water systems, and one was taken out by a 47 hurricane. And the Coast Guard would run out of water there occasionally, and tenders would come, tankers, and fill the cisterns.
There you go.
And then sometimes the schedule of the tenders wasn't at the right time when the drought period started and water was gone in the cisterns. They would take a tanker on trailer, a tanker trailer, down to Jake Stokes' artesian well, which was probably the best and most salt-free flowing well on the island, and they would fill up the tanker.
All the water was brackish.
Yeah, the well water had some salinity. And when I moved into the lighthouse building in 1958, I drank rainwater out of cisterns for 5 years.
Wow.
And
After he fished
until
the raccoons out of it.
I never told my wife. But my wife grew up on Marco Island back in the 30s, late 30s, onward. not before the late 30s. And she was used to it. She was an Allen girl when I brought her here.
Yeah.
So if you had the drought and that was April, May, June time frame, what was it? Was it growing season, everything but those 3 months?
Growing season was more winter.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Betty, let's go back to your discussion about dredging of the Coxsahachie.
Okay.
You said that the Lake Okeechobee did not flow into the Coxsahachie.
That's correct. Not until they
The
dredged.
supply of water to Lake Okeechobee came from the Kissimmee River?
Well, it came from basically sheet flow. You know, when you talk about, think Marjorie Stoneman Douglas's book, The River of Grass. The Everglades is basically very slow moving southward water running on the surface. That was happening from Orlando, Ocala area down to us as well. I mean, even today, if you go up I-75 in the middle of summer, you're going to see standing water off there to your right in a lot of those places. And that's really doing the same thing still. So it's not just, you know, a lake that's feeding the river, but it's just the gradual flow both into the ground and over the top of the ground in the...
Was the St. Lucie River dredged too?
Yes, yes. Yeah. He wanted to drop a bunch of canals down through the Everglades as well, but never got to that.
One more question. The red tide problems that come down from Coxsahachie.
They don't. Number one, the red tide's out to sea.
Well, the red tide's always here, but the other problem has started as
The green algae.
by the flow of water down the Coxsahachie. Is that not true?
Yeah.
No, that's not true.
Not
Does it start right after the dredging, or has this just been around for the last 20
You know,
years?
development has increased, cattle have increased, sugarcane has increased. Which one's to blame? Fertilizer on lawns? You know.
We have an
It just-
excellent coverage on the red tide situation in our book. That
Yeah, we were writing that
it
just as.
covers it, I think, very well. And with some consideration for what we know now and what we knew when I was a kid working in a lab in Naples. We haven't learned anything since.
How far back can you go to, like, some really severe red tide
We're
blooms?
back to
that
the
happened?
days of the Spanish.
That's absolutely, the
also
Spanish in the
talked about
1500s talked about this evil red tide with dead fish.
But most red tide blooms start offshore and north of us, way up around Paso Grill, off of Clearwater in that area. And then the little currents bring it south. And the discharge of the Coxsahachie comes out into San Carlos Bay, Pine Island Sound, and the little drift carries that water south. So there's very little interaction when those red tide blooms first start. When the red tide reaches here, of course, there's nutrient exchange, and it does, I'm sure, help the organism.
Deb, did you have a question?
I wanted to ask Pearl to elaborate a little bit about Tommy Woods, because when I was a kid, he was my favorite fictional, not fictional, but he was a character.
Sure.
But he lived a charmed life as far as I was concerned. His
Yeah.
life was exceptional, especially given his main mode of transportation.
Yeah. Tommy Wood was a pilot, an aircraft pilot. He soloed in 1927. He became a barnstormer. And you can go online and under these new newspapers that are online and search Tommy Wood, and you'll find stories about him taking 3 women barnstorming across the country all the way to LA. And they dipped down into Mexico where they were arrested. It's really good. Then during the war, he enlisted in the Navy. He became a lieutenant commander and a pilot of PBY. He was over in the Pacific Theater around New Caledonia, Australia. And then after the war, he moved to Key West, opened up the Wood Seaplane Service. He was the first seaplane charter to run fishing trips out of Key West. And he'd take fishing parties to dry tortugas and things like that. And a friend of his by the name of Jack Watson was an early Audubon warden who became a Fish and Wildlife Service officer. And he talked Tommy to come to work for the Fish and Wildlife Service somewhere around 47, 48. Tommy did and was transferred to Sanibel. It was a real difficult job search to get someone who was actually crazy enough to come to Sanibel in 1949. None of the other, some of them came, transferred in on condition they could test it with their families, and they couldn't take it. I mean, things weren't easy. Even Deb and I can remember how bad mosquitoes were before mosquito control.
Tell them where he landed his plane.
Okay. When I first met him, he flew. I was at Fish and Wildlife Service Naples Red Tide, and Tommy was Division of Wildlife Refuges, but we had an agreement where he would fly to Naples with, back then he had a Piper Super Cub on floats, and 2 days a week he'd pick me up and we'd fly the coast from Marathon all the way to Paso Grill, not in one day, but in as far east as Okeechobee. And he, when the Red Tide Lab transferred to St. Pete, I resigned and went on like a furlough and then came here to Sanibel. When I got here on Sanibel, he had the first plane in the 60s was a Tri-Pacer. The second was a Piper Super Cub. And he would land it on Tarpon Bay. The last house on Woodring Point Road was a 2-story frame house that Tommy Wood owned. He lived there part of the year for homestead exemption, I think, and part of the year quarters 1 at the lighthouse. And he would fly patrol by air rather than boat to reach all of these remote islands. He patrolled from Chesawiska Refuge up near Tarpon Springs all the way down to Key West Refuge in the Marquise Islands west of Key West. And then at that time, he was concerned about saltwater corrosion on the aircraft floats, and mosquito control was just about to reach coming west from Beach Road. They were coming toward, they had passed Donax and had reached Tarpon Bay Road, and he got with Wayne Miller, the director of mosquito control, and said, hey, don't follow the slough here, please. Dig a canal along the southern border of the Bailey Tract that's about 60 feet wide, and it's about a half-mile long, I think. And that became the seaplane base. And then we graduated, we got a Cessna 180 on floats. And that was the last plane that he had when he retired in, I think, 1971, 71.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Betty and Charles, we can't thank you enough for coming and joining us. I cannot recommend their book enough. I have been part of this for about 16 years now, and all these different stories that we tell, it has the threads and the answers to. I mean, really, it's a fabulous book. It has a lot of things in that I have not heard before, and it kind of glues everything together. So,
and we only have 5 copies today. First come, first served.
True.
Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you.